Gerard, thank you for coming to speak to us.
That's a pleasure, Martin.
Tell me a little bit about your background.
I've got a bit of a mixed background. I'm out of the Catholic world, and I've spent most of my adult life teaching. I taught in high school, and I've done a lot of teaching in adult education, tertiary education, university, and lived in a couple of countries, America, Australia, and moved around a fair bit. But mainly I've worked in Sydney in terms of work and teaching, so a bit of a local boy now.
Now most of that teaching has been in preparing people for ministry.
Yes, I've done a lot of teaching of people for ordination, so ordination candidates, and lots of them. But as well as that, lots of people who are not interested in ordination, but who come to study theology and study worship with an aim to simply helping out in their church or taking up roles or taking up specific roles. Then a third group would be people who simply like to see their life enriched by studying theology.
And you said earlier that one of the areas of your particular interest is in worship.
Yep.
And teaching worship. Tell me a little bit about how you see it from, not only from your current perspective, but really within the context of the Roman Catholic Church.
There's two ways to answer it, Martin. In the way the Church thinks about it, worship is absolutely essential. But often in the way it does things, it's just a bit peripheral. So you get this strange mix of where people come to worship Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, but a lot of the Church's effort goes into other things, and I'd like to see it a bit more balanced. And if we put the effort into people and their approach to worship and the power of their worship and the sense of their worship, maybe a lot of the other things will fall into place a lot faster.
So are you saying then that really the Church in some ways have lost that central focus of the service? Or maybe just unbalanced that?
I think it's unbalanced. I mean, I think they've got the sense of the central focus, and there's a terrific sense of how that central focus is related to people's lives, to care for the poor, and for the works that we like to do as Christians. But often in our thinking, it's just like another thing, rather than something which drives us or impels us. And often the way the Church then gets a bit directive about it, it can be seen as something that must be done in a certain way, as opposed to must be celebrated and at the heart of people's lives.
Now, it's interesting you say that, because I would have thought that one of the kind of distinctives of particularly the Roman Catholic Church's worship is that it is quite directive, in the sense that you follow a particular order of service and a prayer book, a connection with that. Is that not the case?
It is the case, but prayer books they're not quite as easily directed as one would think, especially if you're outside the tradition. But for people like myself who spend a lot of our times investigating the prayer books and their options and their history and their origins, in fact they have form and they have structure and they have guidelines, but they also have remarkable diversity. And we often don't appreciate how diverse a formed worship can be, or a structured worship can be. I know that sounds a bit odd, and you see this big fat book and you think, well, that's a terrific book, it's going to tell us everything. But after a little while, the more close you get to it, you realise it actually is inviting you into more options than you imagined.
So in some ways you're saying that it's really the attitude which you come to the book that changes really what you're doing, because the book allows the diversity, but maybe sometimes the person who's worship leading hasn't explored the diversity. They kind of fit down the well-worn path rather than exploring some of the options that are there.
Yeah, precisely. And those options are there to allow the leader and the community to work together to explore who they are at present and how they can best take up the symbols and the signs and the riches of worship, how they can take up the word. And but you get used to things, and especially in the Roman tradition, where you've got professional leaders, like the ordained are so important in the leadership. They're often so busy, they're doing so many pastoral calls, they're doing a lot of work, that they can fall back to their usuals. And often the people also fall back to the usuals, rather than say, how does this worship open me up? How does it challenge me?
So in some ways you're saying that almost people like the stability of knowing exactly what's going to come next and dealing with that. So in some ways they don't really push the leaders to try that diversity.
They don't know about the diversity because they don't read that's not what they're there. The book's there for them in a sense. They don't read the books. They just come and worship in the structure, in the form. In that sense, they love the forms and the structures. Yeah. It gives you a real comfort in worship. But within those forms, there is a number of ways of doing them. There is surprising openness. So you can actually keep people comfortable in the forms, but challenged by the content and challenged by the way we do them.
Okay. Now, I'm thinking about that in terms of challenge. Obviously, after Vatican II, there was significant changes that happened within some of the forms and structures within worship, in things like the vernacular and those kinds of things. There's still people, though, who think that the Latin Mass is still better than the vernacular. Why would that be, that there's still such a big cohort that would be interested in that?
I think you've got to watch out that the tail doesn't wag the dog here. We've done a bit of work on the size of that cohort in Australia. It's about 1.5%.
So it's actually a very loud cohort.
It's a very loud cohort, and they have deep passion and interest and love, and they've got some strong theological allies, perhaps for different reasons than I might imagine, especially in Australia, because it's also a political thing, particularly in Europe. So, and it's possible to have the Latin Mass, because even the contemporary versions of the Mass that we have in English are also available in Latin. Their particular love is for a particular form of the Latin Mass, created or confirmed around the 1600s. And that's the one they really like.
Okay. And so in some ways they kind of like that, because I suppose maybe that's for some of them what they grew up with. They would be of that particular vintage and cohort, that they may have actually been part of that Latin process.
They were, and others, younger ones, have grown into it. It's also seen by them as a way of confirming the best forms of belief and the truest forms of belief. And it also has a sense about it of being a bit closed to history. It's often claimed it's the historical form. It's one of many, many, many historical forms, and the preceding forms were Greek, not even Latin, in the Roman world. Yeah. So it actually has a history which doesn't suit the traditionalist cause. But deep down, Martin, it's a small movement. 90% of people in the 1960s who went to Mass in the Catholic world embraced the new Mass.
Okay. Now, that's also changed, though, in terms of some of the other, aspects of the service, which, from what I understand of the Roman liturgy, there's a number of high points through the service, rather than as in a Reformed service where really everything moves towards the preaching. But the preaching has changed within the Catholic system, in that whereas the homily was really just a small aspect within it, there's a bigger role to play now with the homily. Would you say that?
I'd agree with that. Let me take up the 2 points. I like to see the Sunday service as like a garden. And a beautifully laid out garden has lots of interesting points, but it's got high points. But all the way through it, you're being stimulated in different ways. So that the range of liturgical forms allows you to be stimulated through, but they should lead to maximum sense of excitement and prayer around the Word, including the preaching, and around the Thanksgiving prayer and the Lord's table. So they're the two absolute high points of it. The preaching has changed remarkably, because now that since the reforms in the 1960s, the word is heard in English, it's heard in your own language. So now the preachers can preach from the text. And what's more, you get 4 readings of the word before they preach. There's an Old Testament reading, a psalm, another Old Testament reading, which could be sung, a New Testament reading, and a gospel. So the preachers have a lot of choice. Everyone hears a lot of the scriptures. And so the preacher has a chance to stimulate the audience from the works they've heard and call some responses forth for them. That's the good preachers, of course. There are some rather ordinary preachers, but we don't know what to do about them.
But is that an issue at the moment in the church? That certainly here in Australia, one of the issues is that a number of the priests come from countries other than Australia, and they have maybe even first languages which are other than English. Is that an issue in terms of the homily?
It's an issue in terms of the homily where 2 things haven't happened. One, whether the diocese which they've taken them into hasn't really worked on their English language competency. So it's just said, well, here's a priest, that will be fine. But in fact, the priest has got to carry out the liturgy so that everyone can be involved. So where they haven't worked on that competency, there's a real problem. The second is where the cultural gap between the priest from the other country and the Australian congregation is so large that the priest doesn't pick up the cues that enable the preaching to take effect. So they preach to their home audience, not to their current audience. So there's been some nice little easy ways to work through this. One parish I'm in, the priest has his sermon typed up and it appears on an overhead or on a little projector. So it keeps it short for a start and everyone can follow it. So it's, actually, they're quite good homilies.
Okay. So it's interesting in terms of enculturation, I suppose, the fact that, I know that there's a number of Filipino priests that come across, and of course that's a very different structured country to Australia. Do they find it hard to be able to preach cross-culturally?
They do, because not only are they preaching cross-culturally, say, from their own culture to the Australian culture, but in the Australian Catholic Church in Sydney there could be at least 10, if not 50 cultures. So how do you preach to that is a huge question. And it's often one that priests from overseas countries have never faced before, because there is a certain, it's not just unique to Australia, but there is a certain normality in Australia of being multicultural. And local-born priests understand that and often come from the diversity of cultures. But to walk in and just not have the presumption that there's a single monolithic culture in front is quite a challenge.
Yeah. Now, one of, I suppose, the thing that most sits in people's thinking for the Roman Catholic liturgy is, of course, the sacrament.
Yep.
How's that developed and changed with the influence of I suppose, more postmodern thought?
There's been, in a sense, there's a radical return to the patristic thought and to even to New Testament thought, which has been very helpful. In terms of thinking about sacrament, one of the great difficulties the Catholic Church has had to deal with is its heritage in the medieval, which was very helpful in the medieval, has not served it well.
So if I can understand that for those who would be listening to this or watching this, you're referring to really the layers of philosophy and things like Aristotle and Plato and those boys who kind of added something to the basis of what sacrament was about.
Not just the layers of philosophy, though they're very interesting and they do have to be unpacked and repacked, but the layers of piety that emerged from it, because it's the piety that really drives the way the people and even the theologians take up the philosophers. And so in the late Middle Ages, for a whole range of factors, there was enormous emphasis on the presence of Christ in the consecrated bread and the consecrated wine. What that left unappreciated was the need and the need for the worship to be an entire worship service of the community gathered, which is much more postmodern thought and much better picked up in the Reformation. So of late, there's been a lot of work in Catholic circles and in official circles as well as in liturgical and theological circles to reappropriate, reunite the people with the worship so they can go, they can participate. There's a strong sense of the power and the centrality of the sacrament. But with that is also balanced the sense of reception of the sacrament, of eating and drinking of the body and blood of Christ, and of hearing the word, which is clearly
so what you're saying is, in some ways, it's almost closer to the Reformed perspective of communion. So really the communio, the togetherness is actually the emphasis rather than, is rebalancing some of that concept.
Yeah, I think that rebalancing is really part of it. And I do think there's been a lot of terrific and positive interaction between the Reformed traditions and the Catholic tradition. So
what's the future for worship in the Roman Catholic tradition, with the influence of particularly young people? I mean, the Catholic tradition has the same problem with the dropout of youth and young people kind of after their first communion or confirmation. I suppose depending on which Catholic church you are, where that goes. But after those kind of the rituals have been completed, there's often a fairly strong drop-off. What's the Catholic Church doing about that in terms of worship particularly?
In terms of worship, it's It's got some strategies, some which seem to be working, some which don't. There's a lot of work done in the Catholic school system on that, but the school system is not well attached to the parish system. So often the local worship doesn't reflect the good things done in the schools, and in fact doesn't seem to be able to replicate it. The energy that priests have to take up the challenge of youth ministry is diminishing because priests are getting older. And so where there's good energy for that, there's actually a lot of good take-up. Where there's poor energy for that, there's a lot of attrition. So that the parishes and the communities themselves haven't really come to a way to deal with that yet. My experience is young people love worship. When you do this, when you take up the options in the services and explore them for them, they enter into it and they engage with it really well, and they come out of it transformed. But we have not been able to sustain that, and in many ways, once Catholic students leave their schools, we've not got a strong post-school university presence that gives them something which is exciting and challenging and enlivening.
So since you create gaps, so they're there until they've kind of finished the rituals of childhood, until they kind of start having children. And then when they start having children, they come back into the process again and go through the rituals for their children's perspective. So what you're saying is it's fairly uneven in terms of what's happening. Is it dependent on how much lay people are involved, or is it dependent on how progressive the priest is? Where's the bottleneck?
At the moment, it's more dependent on the energy of the priest, because that's the entry point for the energy of the lay people. So if the priest is open, feels there's a great need there, wants it met, and is willing to enable people to do that, then you get a lot of progress. But if it's not a priority, or if it's too difficult, or if there's a sense in which, there's lay people should not take up too much involvement, then you get the bottleneck. And that's very frustrating for people, and very frustrating for bishops as well, I must say. It's not just for the congregations.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned bishops, because obviously being a much more hierarchical structure in terms of power structure than obviously the Reformed tradition, what is the role of the bishop in terms of I suppose, talking about what worship would be within these dioceses?
Well, the role of the bishop is paramount, and I think they really have not had a chance to appreciate or to develop it. But the bishop, there's this beautiful little teaching which might sound odd, is that the most visible presence of the church is when the bishop, the priests, the deacons and the people are gathered together in the Sunday worship. And that's seen in the Catholic theology as the high point of the action and the life of the church itself. So the bishop is central. He's central to the imagination of the diocese. He's central to the feel of worship that's there. But he's actually the central one who gathers the people for worship. So when people say, where is the church? The actual liturgical answer is in the Sunday Eucharist, where the bishop, the priest, the deacons and the people are all gathered in their roles, everyone having roles. It's a beautiful vision. Not quite as hierarchical as people imagine. But
but it depends on how you emphasize that, and I suppose it depends on who you are as to how that emphasis would be placed.
Yeah, and in worship, there actually is a sense of hierarchy in worship, but it's very important to understand it. It's a sense in which everyone has their role, and a good hierarchical system fulfills the rights and duties of each level of it. And unfortunately, some liturgy is not hierarchical, it's actually a bit more tyrannical, where there's a tyrant or tyrannosaurus at the top and the rest are underneath. That's not the liturgical vision.
Okay, so effectively that's not how it should be, but unfortunately due to our humanness or our brokenness, sometimes it can end up being that.
Yes, certainly can end up. I think the Reformed Church has much the same interest in that question.
In fact, I think it can be even worse within that, because you end up with just one.
Yes, it may, and without a ritual book, you actually end up with even less than one. Like with the ritual book, at least in the Catholic world, the priest has to obey something else.
Okay. Now in the Catholic world, and this is the final question, just obviously women aren't ordained to the priesthood. But what's the role of women within worship? Is there a role? Is that developing in Australia?
It is developing, and if I could just take worship a bit more broadly, given the range of forms, if women aren't ordained, then they can't take the ordained forms, but they can take all other forms in, say, the Sunday service. But in the other range of services, such as the morning and evening prayer, then there's no distinction between the role of men and women. There might be a distinction if some forms of prayer need an ordained leader, but in the other forms, no. It's about the baptized, and so it's in fact you see very, very, very commonly and. In schools and in many religious communities and in many parishes, it is women leading, women reading, women teaching. So the ordination question is this difficulty there, not the gender question in that sense.
Yes, and I suspect we're not going to be able to fix that one today. So
not today, no. I suspect it's got a few
more years
to go. Yes.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been